scholars and educators, is one of Singapore's best writers. He was awarded the Cultural Medallion for Literature in 1983. He won the prestigious Southeast Asia Writing Award that same year. And in 1998, he won the Mont Blanc NUS Center for the Arts Literary Award for English and many other awards. Actually, I was introduced to Arthur Yap very late in my educational journey, unlike the NIB students that we have. And this was only a few years ago when I was doing my MA at NUS, and I took a course called Singapore Literature. And I remember that we studied Arthur Yap in a segment called Singapore Poetry, together with Edwin Tambu, Robert Yeo, I had always known Arthur Yap as a poet. I mean, as a poet, he's been described in many different ways. A poet of everyday life, one who writes with the eye of a painter, whose style is uniquely Singaporean, who writes without overtly articulating any political stance. He's been compared to American poet William Carlos Williams of the Imagist movement, and E.E. Cummings, particularly in relation to his playful use of language, given his background as a linguist. So it was with some surprise recently that I learned that he also wrote short stories. Okay, and this has been put together in a wonderful collection, I think for the first time, an anthology of his short stories published by NUS Press. Okay, most of the stories were written while he was an undergrad student in the 1960s, and some were written in the 1970s. So we are here today really to celebrate the work of a truly gifted poet, painter, and now short story writer. I'm joined here with my colleagues from the English Language and Literature Academic Group from the National Institute of Education, Angus, Whitehead, and Angelia, Poon, as well as Singapore poet Joshua Ip. Okay, this is going to be an informal panel discussion. I've asked them to share for 5 to 10 minutes their perspective on Yap's book, and then we're going to open the floor for informal discussion. You can raise questions, you can throw questions at the panelists, and also raise any insights or points of view of your own as well. So let's keep this atmosphere conversational and cordial as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn my attention to Angus right now, the editor of this collection. Okay, Angus teaches and writes on at NIE on William Blake, 18th and 19th century labouring class poetry and Singapore poetry. And he's been credited with recovering the work of many of Singapore's forgotten writers.
Well, two, maybe.
Okay. And if some of you remember, I think recently published this collection of short stories by Bradley Napon. Okay, and I believe the launch was here as well.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, a few months back. Okay, and then now, of course, Yap's stories. So let's start with this opening question. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about this book? How did the idea come about, and what was the process of developing this collection?
Okay.
Do you want to use this?
I don't know if I need it, but
yeah,
I'll have a go at it. So really, it kind of came about by accident, I think. What happened? There's recently a collection of essays on Arthur Yap that have come out, and I've been working on one about Yap's use, deployment of specific spaces in Singapore, and I was eager to get the word Bidok and Bodo into an essay, so I was able to cite one of Yap's most famous poems. But also, simultaneously at the time, I'd had some ideas. I was trying to find my feet. I remember wondering what I should kind of work on once I arrived in Singapore. And I'm usually a 19th century, 18th century, long 18th century kind of guy. I remember Philip Holden saying that perhaps I should do something in Singapore in that area. But then all of a sudden, I started to look at Yap's poetry, and I just wondered if there was a chance to do something that kind of superseded this.
And that's my NUS book.
Right, yes. And of course we know now that Irving Goh and Jenny Yap have brought out a very nice collection that's almost like, well, the Big Brother volume to this. Oh no, Big Brother sounds very bad, doesn't it? But you know what I mean. But in the process of looking for unpublished what should we say, forgotten poems, I found these forgotten short stories. It was the first 3 1960s ones that really kind of lit my candle, and at the same time I hadn't realised Rajiv Patki had kind of discovered these as well. And I think both of us separately have been blown away by the first story, which gives the name to this volume, Noon at 5 o'clock. And I think reading that has probably been one of my most sublime experience with Singapore poetry since I arrived here. And then we had the usual problem, just with, as with the Nalcon book. Did we have enough stories? It seemed very thin. I think we found altogether with the ones that were in the 1978 collection, that had been the GCSE collection, that was just 6 stories. But mercifully, we were able to find 2 more. There was the one from the 1960s in Edward Thumbu's collection, The Flowering Tree, and then we found this very late and very odd story, a beginning and a middle without an end, which I still can't get my head around, though I'm supposed to have officially edited it and talked about it in the book. I'm still very perplexed. Richly and satisfyingly perplexed by that story. But yeah, altogether those were the stories. And yeah, the book seemed as if it was ready, but then it was my fault. I think there was kind of hiatus where for some reason it kind of, I don't know, we had to wait a little while for it to actually sort of germinate. But then all of a sudden I got some renewed interest, and I remember, name drop, happily in a hotel in Calcutta, sort of really working on this and finalising the manuscript. So I think it's very nice to think it's been kind of through the sieve of Calcutta in some ways. I'm sure Arthur Yap would perhaps quite like that. Is that enough, Suzanne? I don't know, just to, anything else you'd want to ask?
No, I mean, we'll ask more questions later, but did you mention the first discovery, the process of the first discovery?
What was it like? Or
How did you stumble on stories?
Oh yes, so a big plug for NIE's library, I think, to some degree. Here we only have, I mean, it's an interesting stage, isn't it, in kind of Yap scholarship at the moment. I think it's very relatively early times, and we only have here the collected published stories. We don't know, perhaps there are unpublished manuscript stories, and one day perhaps they will be published. But yes, I would put it down to NIE Library. Thankfully, they had the collection of Focus undergraduate magazines from NUS, and just looking through those by accident, stumbling upon that Noon at 5 o'clock. You can't beat the feeling, I think. Yes, that was like a eureka moment in Jurong. Can you imagine that? Yes, that's right, yes. Yeah.
Okay, just one question before we move to Angelia. You know, I think you were probably the first to see all these stories in this collection and put it together. What sort of stood out for you as you sort of saw them, as you organized them? Did anything strike you when you first organized this anthology?
It would be nice, wouldn't it? But I think in some ways it's quite interesting how different they are. I think Arthur Yap wasn't so... Yeah, I'd like to think that Arthur Yap, you know, was seeing the short story as an extremely important form, but I think you have to concede it took a backseat to the poetry to some degree, and sporadically he wrote these kind of stories. In the collected poems there are some vignettes, and maybe there's some arguments as to whether they should be considered as short stories rather than poems. But yeah, I was just kind of thinking about that. I think even though there are so few, they kind of, as I try and say in the introduction, they seem to fall into these interesting kind of subsets, like you have the undergraduate poems, which in some ways, in a weird way, these early ones to me seem the most attractive in some ways. Maybe, I don't know, that's just me. Then we have this odd one in around 1969, Su Meng, which seems to be about this disabled Singaporean child. And then we have this kind of triptych from the 70s, and then we have this final story that strangely he revised 10, 11 years later, which is quite interesting, and making it a very different story. So, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. I think we'll get a chance to talk about the stories later, and again, feel free to ask any questions later on. I'm going to move on to Angelia. We just want to give them a chance to sort of share their perspectives. Angelia, I want to hear about what your thoughts are of Arthur Yap as how he's been described as a uniquely Singaporean writer. Just a little bit of introduction. I think her research interests are in post-colonial, transnational lit, as well as Singapore lit. And a few years ago, along with NUS Press, published by NUS Press, she co-edited a volume with Philip Holden and Shirley Lim titled Writing Singapore, a Historical Anthology of Singapore Literature. And this pioneering volume, I think, assembles a range of literary writing in English in Singapore across history that I think has been very influential, considering the fact that anthologies play a huge role. They are catalysts for what we call literary canonization. So the anthology also includes a collection of Yap's poems. Okay, and if we consider this notion of a canon, broadly speaking, as involving works that have influence and are representative of a particular culture, then a question is, how do we situate Arthur Yap in what can be called a Singapore canon? So I wonder whether, Angelia, you can sort of offer your perspective on this. What is Yap's contribution to Singapore writing and the idea of a Singapore canon? If that makes sense. Yeah.
I think when we were doing writing Singapore, at that point I wasn't aware of Arthur Yap as someone that had written short stories. So in a way, and I guess most of us thinking of him primarily as a poet, so we focused on that. At least that was the section that Shirley Lim edited. So he came under that section. But I mean, I think in a way his place in the canon as a poet is assured, and all this the fact that he's a great poet, the wordplay, imagery, as a poet of everyday life, but also as a kind of social commentator. And I think actually this comes through in